Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading property experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, and Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the 2014 and 2015 Property Investment Advisors of the Year.
Alright folks, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas.
Jeez, your voice almost went
Hey,
there,
did you
didn't it?
like that? Welcome to the Property Couch, mate.
On Christmas Day.
Christmas Day.
Christmas Day. Who would have thought we'd get up, we'd come in,
And a superstar guest as
I know,
well.
who's also, she's put the turkey in the oven and
Yes.
she's just taken a moment to have a chat with us.
Well, you are, of course, talking about the one and only Nerida Conisbee. Hello, Nerida. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thanks for having me on this super day.
The big chief economist at the REA Group.
I know.
She's a
we
ripper.
big hitters on Christmas
Oh,
Day. This is a massive coup for the Property Couch.
Well, this
But,
is our Christmas present to us.
well, it's funny you say that, Ben, because I was going to talk to Nerida about her Christmas list from a property perspective. But before we do, how are you, Nerida?
I'm well.
How did 2018 treat you as a property analyst?
Yeah, look, I mean, it was certainly a busy year, and it was certainly a very different year to 2017. So it was, property is always in the news, and certainly residential property in Sydney and Melbourne was certainly in the news this year.
No, surely not. No, the world was falling in, but guess what? The sun kept coming up.
Yeah.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Nerida. I tell you what, there's a lot of clickbait out there at the moment, wasn't there, in 2018?
Hey, Nerida, are you in more demand now that the market's sort of turned into big cities than when it was FOMO, or is it just another version of the same sort of lineup for you?
Look, I think, people don't like to talk about the negativities that much. So although the media does, definitely.
Oh, they love it.
They love it. They love all clicks and slaughter or whatever that, the culmination of ultimate negativity. But, when I'm presenting, it's often, particularly in Sydney at the moment, people are, looking for any good news. So, that's a bit more tricky, but generally, when markets are starting to turn, that's when people are wanting a bit of insights as to what's happening.
And so that's the big question. Obviously, as we finished out 2018, there were no green shoots yet, or were there some green shoots from what you were seeing?
Yeah, look, I guess it depends where you are. I mean, we're still, in Hobart at the end of November, and Hobart is still looking very, very positive and still seeing very high buyer demand and, continuing to do very well. Adelaide hit its highest median ever recorded in 2018, and we're continuing to see very high levels of activity in Adelaide, and not just for the inner suburbs or the beachside or Adelaide Hills, but somewhere like Port Adelaide is starting to see quite a bit of activity on our site. So, those two areas are doing pretty well at the moment.
What do you see?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, what do you mentioned Hobart. What do you see in terms of, obviously it's had a little spike of late. Do you see, like, historically it has a spike and then sort of sits tight for quite a number of years?
A volcano, Bryce. It erupts every 12 years and then it goes dormant for the next 12.
Well, Ben's used an analogy of a volcano. Do you see it doing a volcano, or do you see it bucking the trend this cycle round?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's been bucking the trend now for a few years, so it has been seeing double-digit growth, I think, for about 2 to 3 years now. So I think what happened in Tasmania, it has traditionally just been a government-run town with a bit of agriculture, but it is changing. When I was over there, you could really see that there was a lot more younger people running small businesses. Certainly, Mona has made a difference in terms of tourism, and the education sector really seems to be picking up as well. So, I think that the really strong run of pricing probably won't continue, but I don't think we're going to see a big drop-off in pricing anytime soon, because it is really underpinned by quite good economic fundamentals.
Mm. Yeah, okay, that's a good story. And Adelaide, the quiet achiever. What's that book about? I think I can. Going up the hill, that sort of steam train or whatever it was. Yeah, that's Adelaide, right, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, Adelaide, it never sees those heady highs of double-digit growth, but at the same time, it never sees those lows of big declines. And, I think looking at Adelaide, it certainly is a city that does attract a lot of investors. We can see a lot of activity coming out of Melbourne and Sydney in particular. When we have a look at search activity, a lot of the search activity does focus more on premium Adelaide. So, when we have a look at buyer activity, it does seem to be, places like Unley and Glenelg and Crafers, they all do very well. But when we have a look at rental activity, it's a bit different. We start to see a lot of the more affordable suburbs seeing very high demand. So, I think it's a really interesting mix of activity in Adelaide. And I think what's happening there is, again, a bit like Hobart, there's some pretty good economic conditions there, but it is centred a lot around manufacturing and more blue-collar activity, which is kind of driving the market a little bit differently.
Well, obviously they've got the big contract for the subs and the rapid response. So they've got a few things going well. I mean, that money hasn't flowed in yet because they're still in contract negotiations. So that work hasn't really commenced to scale for those submarines that they've ordered. And that's, tens of billions of dollars and a few other things going on. So, you're right. I think I look at Unley and all those inner city areas and I just say that is a growth story. And then I look at the stuff you're talking about in terms of the rental, and there's also people chasing yield there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of confidence in Adelaide too. I mean, I suppose, although the rental activity is kind of in the lower cost areas, we've started to see quite a few suburbs hit $2 million in Adelaide, which has never happened before. And, I think at that higher price point, I think people living there are really starting to feel that things are changing and Adelaide's doing pretty well. And even in a market where, finance is challenged and there's a lot of political uncertainty, it's a market worth looking at.
Yeah, great. When they can keep the lights on, goes all right.
Hey, what about the AFL Premiership city of Perth, Nerida? Perth is. Perth is interesting. It was looking really good up until June quarter on our site. We were seeing consecutive back-to-back growth in buyer activity and rental activity. That rental activity is still there, but the buyer demand does seem to be really choppy. So, one quarter we'll see it pick up and then the next quarter it will pull back. And it's certainly not a straightforward recovery that we're seeing in Perth. But, I think, obviously premium Perth is doing very well. If you have a look at the western suburbs of Perth, that, they're doing pretty well. If you go to the beachside areas, places like Fremantle are actually doing quite well at the moment as well. But, it's not a fast recovery, but it's it's happening. But yeah, it's kind of a little bit stop-start at the moment.
I mean, we've got to talk up the suburb of Fremantle because their football side ain't that great.
Does that feel better now? It's 1-1 because I opened the batting with. Do you feel okay now?
I feel better.
Got it off your chest.
I got it off my chest.
Hey, how often do you visit the other towns, Perth, Adelaide, even some of the regionals compared to the bigger cities in your role throughout a year, Nerida?
So Perth, I'm probably there maybe 3 times a year. Brisbane, I'm there a bit more often because I'm sitting on the South East Queensland Housing Supply Panel. So I'm in Brisbane probably every couple of months. Obviously Melbourne a lot, it's our headquarters. Sydney, I live in Sydney. Hobart I hadn't been to for a very long time, but I was speaking at a conference there in November, so got to have a look around. So yeah, I mean it's a bit of a mix. I'm planning to spend a bit of time in regional Queensland next year. We're certainly seeing things very slowly start to pick up. So it's a very creaky start to a recovery, but we're starting to see in some suburbs that, there's a little bit more buyer activity, a little bit more rental activity, and it looks like the start of a very slow recovery, similar to what we're seeing in Perth.
So just for context, obviously the Adani mine, a smaller scale in that sort of basin area. So we have noticed people talking about real low vacancy rates in Mackay. We absolutely know that the vacancy rates up in Cairns are very, very tight. And that's had pent up, sort of vacancy rates for a long time. Yields are excellent up there. But we're also noticing jobs growth is there, but we haven't seen that flow through just yet to property price increases as much as we would have expected ourselves. So are they the sort of, or is Townsville in the mix as well in terms of what you're going to go and look at?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing it across the board. I mean, even like somewhere like Gympie, we're starting to see this increase in buyer activity. But you're right, it isn't yet flowing through to pricing. But, it does take time. When we have a look at what happens in, I guess somewhere like Hobart, where we saw almost 2 years of very elevated buyer activity in Hobart, but then no movement in prices for quite some time. We can see that it does take time for it to switch people to start transacting at a higher activity and then flowing through to pricing.
That's good. So what was your read on Brisbane? Obviously, the data suggests that it's still growing, but is it a two-tier market there? Is it houses and units telling different stories?
Yeah, look, I think it is. I mean, Brisbane was obviously ground zero in terms of concerns about oversupply, and the Reserve Bank called it out as being somewhere that they were worried about as to the impact on financial stability. So I think it was an area that there was a lot of concern. I think the issues have probably flowed through, and anyone looking for a really great apartment in Brisbane, something that's very high quality in a great location, they're actually not that easy to find anymore. So I think a lot of those risks have really flowed through. I guess with Brisbane housing, though, we continue to see, the northern inner north particularly do very well. So, places like Paddington continue to see very, very high demand. I think if you have a look at the economic fundamentals underpinning Queensland's economy, it's all looking pretty good. So, Brisbane and then also Gold Coast is another one that just seems to be continuing to see lots of buyer and renter activity and lots of people wanting to be there, whether they're wanting to be there to invest or wanting to move there.
And you're in a privileged position being on that steering committee or that working group around Southeast Queensland. What's sort of some of the agenda items for that particular working group that you're looking to do for that housing story in that area?
Yes, I guess it's getting a good understanding as to the capacity of Southeast Queensland. So, you do have, I guess one of the good things about Queensland, they do have very large local government areas. So, there has been some really good data collection that's been done and a good understanding of the capacity of each of the local areas. And so it's really working with the Queensland government in terms of combining that information and making sure that there is enough housing supply for Southeast Queensland, and also looking at potentially the areas that there won't be enough housing supply. So it's a great project. In terms of understanding where they're at, they are really one of the leaders in terms of a state government getting a good understanding of their capacity.
Where have you identified that there won't be enough supply?
It's still in working mode, so I can't really say,
Sure.
but it's look, overall it's pretty good. There's not many areas that are showing capacity problems. I guess it gets a little bit more problematic when you switch from understanding broad hectare availability, which is quite clear that you've got a lot of land and you can put so many houses. It becomes a little bit more complicated when you start to look at higher densities in middle ring and inner ring suburbs where, a lot of capacity issues become a little bit more complicated because, ultimately you're doing infill sites and trying to understand what land will be available becomes a lot more difficult.
Okay, all
right, so there's a good wrap of 2018.
You didn't sneak in Canberra, did you?
Oh, well, Canberra's great, but we don't buy in Canberra because of the land tax. So can you get on the steering committee in Canberra and tell them to reduce their land tax and we'll come and buy a few properties there?
That's right. Yeah, it is an unpopular tax for investors, for sure.
Yeah,
Particularly when you don't own the land.
Yes.
when you're a leasehold.
Yeah.
So looking forward to 2019, interested in your thoughts around, clearly 2018 was the year of the credit crunch. What do you see that doing in 2019? Do you anticipate the handbrake staying on as much as it is or releasing a touch? And then sort of flowing that onto your views on the economy and interest rates?
Yes, I suppose there's two big influences on the market next year. The first is obviously the final outcome of the Royal Commission. Second is, what will happen with things like negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions. And, will we see a change in government, which, is looking increasingly likely. So I guess the first one is the Royal Commission. So it obviously has wrapped up In terms of the way banks have reacted to the Royal Commission, they did shut down lending pretty quickly. You know, if we have a look at when the Royal Commission started, it was in December last year. You know, almost immediately they started to put a handbrake in terms of who they'd invest to and started to increase requirements for information and all the rest. So with the Royal Commission wrapping up, I think, you know, best case, it might actually, that the recommendations from the Royal Commission may lead to the banks easing up a little bit, because, you know, if they have been under so much scrutiny and undertaking any risky behaviour when they're under so much scrutiny is, you know, obviously not something that they wanted to do. So I think best case will ease up a bit. There has been a few alarmist stories about the fact that they may even tighten up further to the extent that, you know, people on an $80,000 income would only be able to borrow, you know, $200,000. But, you know, I don't think it's just so unlikely that, because the ultimate aim of the Royal Commission wasn't to shut down lending, and it wasn't to make the banks go bust, and it wasn't to shut down the housing market. It was to stamp out bad behaviour. So, you know, as long as that happens, I think banks will be allowed to get back to business and get back to the business of lending.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, they really didn't find any systemic risk in the lending side. What they did have was isolated cases of people that they called the loans in which they shouldn't have done, and that was more like rural or business lending. And they found a couple of bad bankers out in northern Sydney, and maybe, you know, 2 or 3 bad brokers. Like, you know, that's the interesting bit for me. There wasn't any sort of, where they found the shocking behaviour was taking commissions from dead people, still charging fees, not paying insurance policies out. So I think that side of it, and we're seeing the banks now get out of financial services and just concentrate on banking. So I'd be really surprised if they decided that they needed to clamp down further. But, you know, they're also picking on mortgage brokers by the looks of things as well, in terms of trail commissions. They really just don't like anyone getting paid anything other than salary. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's certainly been an interesting year for financial services.
Hey, you flagged negative gearing. What's your view? What's your team's view on what impact those proposed changes, albeit as scantily detailed as they are, would have on the property market and the general economy?
Yeah, look, I guess I was surprised that they were pushing ahead with the changes as a policy statement. I think when that policy change was announced by the ALP, the market was running red hot, and it was problematic for first home buyers. And, you know, first home buyers are very sensitive to very strong price growth. That we don't see a lot of activity when price growth is very strong. They love an incentive, government incentives that they can be provided. They do respond very positively to that. But, I think the biggest problem for first home buyers was that there were so many investors that were looking at similar priced properties in similar areas to them. And so, there was a lot of competition for many of them. So yeah, I was surprised that they were pushing ahead, given that whole situation has been flipped, and we've seen this massive drawback in investor activity, and first home buyers are highs we haven't seen for quite some time, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. I guess that I think there's 2 risks with the change. I think it is already creating a lot of uncertainty. I think there's a lot of people quite nervous and really holding back at the moment until they get a full understanding of what the changes will be made. So I guess that uncertainty is very negative. There has been a lot of modelling to suggest what the price impact will be, and one of the best ones was by Riskwise and Pete Wargent, where they went city by city, and it was a pretty methodical analysis that they did, and they were suggesting price impacts of up to 10%. So that's not great in a market like Sydney in particular, where prices are already
because that's not just affecting the investor; it's every homeowner. So,
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And also you have to remember too that 10% won't be spread evenly across Sydney. I mean, there's going to be places that are hit far more than that 10%. Yeah. So, so I guess that's really problematic. But longer term, I think the bigger issue too is around rental housing, that in the end, almost all rental housing is provided by mum and dad investors in Australia, and there's really been no indication of a backup plan for if we start to lose a lot of investors and we start to lose rental housing. What do we do about rising rents? And if you consider the average renter, they're typically spending a lot more of their income on housing costs than someone that owns a property. If you're a single parent, you're more likely to be a renter. If you're younger, you're more likely to be a renter. So they are very vulnerable to increases in rental levels. And at this stage, it really hasn't been investigated fully as to what you do when you start to get pockets of rental crisis.
And what's interesting about that is, guess what? That's not a federal issue. That's a state issue, because states provide public and social housing, not the federal government, right? So, this is a rob Peter to pay Paul. So where are the state governments then going to raise their revenue? Is it going to be, through higher payroll taxes? Not really, because you wouldn't be able to raise that much. Guess what it's going to be? It's going to be GST. So, this is the problem. But that's why I think they've kept the policy alive, is because they're claiming a $32 billion injection of tax receipts based on their modelling that they did in 2015. Which I would contest isn't going to come. But obviously, as I've said, both parties have an absolute problem with excessive spending, and they want to buy the election. So, that's our challenge in terms of what that looks like. So that's why they didn't drop the policy, because they've got all this war chest of money that they're going to go out and promise everyone kickbacks and incentives and favours for their vote.
Yeah, which at this stage they probably don't even need to do, but that's it's going to be a very, very interesting election when it's called.
Yeah. So, what other things do you think are going to sort of play out in 2019 in your view, Nerida?
Yes, I guess once we get the final outcome of the Royal Commission, once the election's been called, I do think we'll start to see a lot more stability in the market. So from about mid next year, I think things at least will be certain, and we can certainly see that with any investment, whether it's shares or whether it's property or whatever, that stability is something that people like, and they invest more readily in those sorts of environments. So I think we'll start to see at least a flattening out and a stabilising in places like Sydney and Melbourne next year, and that's obviously positive, not just for investors, but in terms of I guess confidence in residential.
Good story. Now, finally, we saw the GDP numbers for September quarter, and they were a little bit light on. Surprised a lot of economists in terms of how light they were. We've seen Shane Oliver earlier this month talk about a possible rate cut as opposed to a rate increase being the next move from the RBA. Have you formed any opinion around that yet, or are you still on the fence in regards to where you see GDP and where you see interest rates in 2019?
Yeah, look, I think Shane's right. I mean, I don't think the Reserve Bank are going to be clambering for a rate cut anytime soon. You've had one lot of data that is looking pretty weak after a June quarter figure that looked very positive. We saw that 6-year high GDP growth in June. We saw unemployment hit that 5% level, which is a rate at which we do expect to see wage rises. So the RBA will be watching things very closely, as they do, and continuing to keep an eye on what happens with all forms of economic data, whether it's employment, inflation, wages growth, all aspects of it. I think that the bit that is going to be potentially very negative for Australia is what's been happening in the US and China with regards to the trade war. And we're seeing such choppy news in terms of how that's going. 1 week we see it's all sorted out, and the next week we see it's starting to collapse again, and that has such a huge impact on our economic growth, because if China starts to falter, then Australia, given we're so closely linked to China in terms of our economic growth, that could have a very negative bearing on us. So I think that's the bit next year that will ultimately impact where the economy goes, and then ultimately impact what the RBA decide to do with interest rates.
There we have it. It's coming from the expert. So, Nerida, what about realestate.com.au? What are you guys, you got anything that you can share with us in terms of what you're doing on your site to give investors and owner-occupiers more research to look at, or any data to investigate? Is there any exciting projects?
Any little couch exclusives?
We are launching all our own pricing data now. So this year we purchased a company called HomeTrack. So HomeTrack are a company that do automatic valuation models for banks. So, they are very highly regarded by all the banks, and they've been putting together all their pricing data. So we're starting to put all our updated pricing data on our site on every suburb profile. You can get all the updated pricing information. So that started. The HomeTrack team have developed an index, a price index. So they've taken the methodology that HomeTrack use in the UK, and they're adapting it to the Australian market. So it's a combination of output from their AVMs, but also using some of the data that we collect. Obviously we collect a lot of information on our site in terms of pricing. So they're adding that into it as well, and we'll be launching that early next year. So I guess that's a very, very big project for us, and we're very concentrated on that. And then I guess the other bit is, other data stories that we do every month on our site, and they're really popular. We find that when we send out EDMs to customers, that people love to know where their suburb sits in terms of whether it is a very popular suburb, or whether it's a really great lifestyle suburb, or if it's a suburb that's seen very strong price growth. So we will be continuing to launch those EDMs, and so I encourage everyone to make sure you've got a login to realestate.com.au so you can get access to those.
And that's why you're the number one real estate search portal in Australia.
Exactly. Hey, Nerida, we absolutely love having you on the couch. You make economics sound interesting and fun, and that's what we love about you. We consider you a friend. We've got you on the phone because of the enormity of the day, but at some point in 2019 we'll get you back into the studio and give us an update on how the market is going. But thanks for your time today. We'll let you get back to your family, and
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to you guys. Looking forward to chatting in 2019.
Yeah, we'll see you then. Thanks, Nerida. And Ben, mate, I'm going to release you back to the Christmas turkey and the bonbons, and until the next episode.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce. Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas, everyone. See you next week.
Want more great content from The Property Couch? If you haven't had a chance to go back to the foundational episodes, we got good news for you. Go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and check out the free binge guide, which gives you the insights you need from the first 20 episodes, where we unpack the foundational pillars of the Insider's Guide to Property, Finance and Money Management. It's completely free and available now.